What's up, guys, and welcome to another session of the Quarantined Youth Group. A whole bunch of us just got finished playing a Zoom game night starting at 5:15. So if you weren't in on that, make sure you get the link so you can join us next Wednesday as we just hang out and play games together. So it's good to see y'all again. And we are going to continue with our Recalculating series today. Before we get into our series, I have a very important question I have to ask you. See, I was getting a few comments from two very specific people in my life telling me how much they hated my face and my beard and I needed to get rid of all the hair on my neck. So I shaved, but now Jamie is very unhappy with my goatee. And honestly, I'm not going to lie, I just shaved it like this because I knew she wouldn't like it. And it was just kind of to bug her. But now that I've had it, I'm kind of liking it, and I think I might keep it. So I'm going to put a poll question up in the top right there. So I want you to click on that poll and tell me keep the goatee or shave the goatee. And you're not going to hurt my feelings either way, but I am kind of liking it. So just know which way I'm leaning. All right, so it's very important for tonight. I need you to do that. All right, you get to play a role in my face, okay? So participate in that poll, vote for me, because I might just have some rose-colored sunglasses on and think I look good when I look dumb. That's happened before. All right, so we went over Abraham last week, right? So where we are talking about recalculating, what do we do when God completely changes our lives? Because that's what's happening right now. Our lives have been completely shifted, completely changed, where everything we were doing, we're no longer doing. Everything we continue doing, we're having to do in a different way. But recalculating is not new to God or to God's people. That God has actually been changing people's lives for a long time. And we looked at Abraham last week at how Abraham tried to take a shortcut. Abraham knew where God was leading him, but then Abraham tried to recalculate God's recalculations and take a shortcut to get there instead of trusting in God's timing. Tonight, we are going to look at Joseph in Genesis, starting in chapter 37, going all the way to the end of the book of Genesis. And what we're going to see with Joseph is that when God shifts his life, completely recalculates his life, Joseph continues to be faithful in each and every situation he finds himself in, no matter how terrible that situation is. So if you got your Bibles, turn to Genesis 37, and we're going to get into Joseph and how his life was recalculated by God.
All right, now I want a little digital show of hands in here of who is their parent's favorite, right? So every parent has a favorite. They might not say they love you more, but there is one they at least like a little bit more. Now, of course, if your parents are watching this with you, your parents don't have a favorite. It's just everybody else's parents that have a favorite. But when one is the favorite, you know it, whether you're that person or it's one of your siblings, because they get away with a little bit more, the consequences are a little bit less, the tone of voice talking to them is just a little bit nicer. You get in trouble when they don't, or you don't get in trouble when they do. You know who the favorite is. And so tonight we're going to be talking about Joseph, and Joseph also happened to be the favorite. All right, Joseph had 11 brothers who were the sons of Jacob. So last week we talked about Abraham. Abraham had the son Isaac. Isaac had the son Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 sons, one of whom was Joseph. And Joseph was Jacob's favorite. But it wasn't like he was just a little bit his favorite, or that They just thought he was the favorite. It was pretty outspoken and outright that Joseph was Jacob's favorite. In fact, he made him a coat that was filled with many colors. It was a robe that was many colored, which back in that day would have been an extremely expensive, extremely time-consuming task to make a robe like that. And only Joseph had that robe. Joseph was Jacob's favorite, which, as you can imagine, rubbed his brothers the wrong way a little bit. That Joseph's brothers didn't really like him because they knew that he was their dad's favorite. So we are going to be talking about Joseph tonight. And remember, we're talking about recalculating. So God is going to send Joseph, he's going to send his life a little bit crazy. He's going to send his life on a completely different path than what he anticipated. And how is Joseph going to respond to how God recalculates his life? All right, so yes, he was the favorite. His brothers didn't like him for it, but he was also a little arrogant about it, okay? So the very first time we're introduced to Joseph in Genesis chapter 37, in verse 2, he is tattletaling on his brothers. It says that Joseph comes back to his dad and gives a bad report on his brothers. That's just like the favorite, to be a tattletale, okay? That's just what the favorites do. They tattletale. All right, so Joseph tattletales on his brothers. His brothers already don't like him, and then he has two dreams. And so in his first dream, he and his brothers are putting wheat together, and all of his brothers' wheat stands up and bows down to his wheat. And then in the second dream, Joseph is there with his brothers, and the moon, the sun, and the stars all bow down to Joseph. And of course, Joseph didn't have to tell his brothers this, but like any favorite, Joseph tells his brothers, hey, y'all are all going to bow down to me, and they hate him even more. And you can almost hear the implied meaning behind their retort to him, where it's kind of like, yeah, that'll happen over my dead body, or over your dead body. You see, a few days later, a few weeks later, it doesn't give us the time frame, but Joseph is sent out by his dad to check on his brothers who are out in another town being shepherds. They are wandering, moving with the sheep, caring for the sheep, and Joseph is sent to them. And his brothers see Joseph coming from a long way off, and they come up with a plan. Their plan is to kill Joseph. But their brother Reuben talks him out of it and is like, no, let's just throw him in a pit. But then behind Reuben's back, they throw him in the pit and then sell Joseph into slavery. And Joseph ends up in the house of Potiphar, who is the chief of guards in Egypt. So Joseph has now moved from being the favorite son to his life has just been drastically changed, drastically altered to where he is now a slave in Egypt. But even being a slave in Egypt, God is still with Joseph. I want you to read what it says about how God moves with Joseph in Egypt. This is Genesis chapter 39. I'm going to start reading in verse 4. Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. From the time that he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was on all that he owned in the house and in his fields. He left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food. And so Joseph is greatly blessed and becomes. So he goes from being the favorite son to being the favorite slave. A pretty big step down, okay, but he got us still with him, except Joseph didn't just catch the eye of Potiphar, he also caught the eye of somebody else, okay? This is still in verse 6. Now Joseph was well-built and handsome. Reminds me of myself. All right. Now Joseph was well-built and handsome. And after some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." But he refused. "Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house." And he ordered all that he owns under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil, and how could I sin against God? That Joseph, did you hear that last line? How could I sin against God? That Joseph, in the midst of his pretty terrible circumstances, being a slave in Egypt, remains faithful to God. That he does not allow his circumstances to then dictate if he is going to follow God or not, but he continues to remain faithful to God. And no, Potiphar's wife, I'm not going to sleep with you because I will not do this sin. I will not do this evil. Potiphar's wife was pretty insistent, though, and instead of taking no for an answer, she continues, and then one day, Joseph finds himself in the house alone, just him and her, and it basically says she throws herself at him, and he takes the advice of 1 Corinthians, even though I know it hadn't been written yet, and he just runs away. He flees. But she grabs his outer garment, his outer robe, and holds on to it, and in her embarrassment and in her anger at being rejected so much, she goes and tells everybody there that Joseph tried to rape her, and here was the robe to prove it. Her husband comes home. She tells her husband, Joseph tried to rape me. Here is his robe to prove it. And so now Joseph is thrown in prison. Circumstances are getting a little bit worse. And I think it's interesting here, okay, that sometimes you can do the right thing and still end up with bad consequences. That Joseph was doing the right thing, but because he did the right thing, he ended up in a worse situation. There are going to be times where you can do the right thing with your friends, but it is going to cause you to lose friends. You can do the right thing, but it might cause people to not want to be around you. All of a sudden, you're the goody two-shoes that nobody wants to hang around. All of a sudden, you're the guy who's no fun, or you think you're better than me because you don't want to do that. It just turns out to be true that doing the right thing can sometimes lead to bad consequences for us. But we still have to remain faithful to God. We still have to be like Joseph and do the right thing, even when we know the consequences that come of it aren't going to be good. Because like Joseph ends up in prison. But even in prison, he still does pretty well. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He granted him favor with the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything that he did successful. So Joseph has moved from the favorite son to the favorite slave to now the favorite prisoner, continuing to take steps down and down and down the social totem pole. But God remains with him even as his circumstances get worse and worse, even as the journey seems to be getting more and more terrible. And so while Joseph is in prison, there are two of the king's officials who are also in prison, and they have dreams. They have dreams that they don't understand, and Joseph actually is able to interpret their dreams for them, or he says God gives him the meaning of their dreams. And so he interprets their dreams for them. One is going to their position, the other is going to be executed, and 3 days later, his interpretation becomes true. And so the one who was restored, the cupbearer of the king, is now back in the king's court. And 2 years later, okay, so he's now been in prison for 2 more years. 2 years later, the Pharaoh is having dreams. And he has 2 dreams, and none of the wise men of Egypt, none of the magicians of Egypt are able to tell him what his dreams mean. But the cupbearer remembers Joseph. And he says, Pharaoh, there's a guy in prison. He interpreted a dream for me. Maybe he can interpret a dream for you. And so Pharaoh brings Joseph to him, and he says, can you interpret this dream for me? And Joseph says, well, I can't interpret dreams, but God can interpret dreams, and if God shows me what your dream means, I will tell you. And so Pharaoh tells him his dreams, and Joseph tells him, this is what God says your dreams mean. There are going to be 7 years of great harvest, 7 years of great produce, but then that is going to be followed by 7 years of great famine. That so much so that the 7 years of greatness is going to be completely forgotten, completely wiped out. But Joseph then adds some advice on top of that. He says, so over these 7 years of good, over the 7 years of plenty, you should store up 1/5 of everything that is brought in. So of everything that is brought in, store 1/5 of it in the storehouse so that you will be able to survive over these next 7 years of famine following it. And the Pharaoh thought, hey, that's a good idea. None of my wise men could help me. So now, Joseph, I'm going to make you in charge of this, and you are going to be the second highest ranked person in Egypt. No one will be over you except for me, the Pharaoh. That is an absolutely crazy decision. That Joseph has gone from favorite son to favorite slave to favorite prisoner, but a prisoner, and been a prisoner for a while, to all of a sudden in one day, he is now the second highest ranked person in all of Egypt. And so everything happens just as Joseph said it would. They have 7 great years of harvest, and then it's followed by 7 great years of famine. And Joseph is in charge of bringing in all of the grain. And then in the 7 years of famine, he is in charge of distributing it and selling it so that it stays rationed so that people can still survive. But it wasn't just Egypt that was under a famine. Jacob's sons in Canaan were also under a famine as well. And so Jacob sends 10 of his sons to Egypt to buy grain, to buy wheat, to bring back to them. And so all of a sudden, Joseph, who is in charge, 10 of his brothers are now at his feet, bowing before him, asking for wheat. Pretty reminiscent of his dream of so many years ago. But they don't know that they are talking to Joseph. I mean, why in the world would they ever think that this Egyptian in front of them would be their brother that they sold into slavery, who I'm sure at this point they assumed he had already been killed in some form or some fashion. And so Joseph does not reveal to them who he is at first. He plays this little cat and mouse game with them. We don't have time to go through the whole cat and mouse game with them, but you should read that on your own. Genesis chapter 42 through 45. Joseph kind of messes with them a little bit, kind of maybe getting a little bit of revenge for what they brought him through. But, eventually, they actually go, they get their other brother, Benjamin. So all 11 brothers are now in Egypt, and Joseph reveals to them, I am your brother, Joseph. And they don't believe him, but here's how he responds. It's Genesis chapter 45, verse 4. Then Joseph said to his brothers, please come near me, and they came near. I am Joseph, your brother, he said, the one you sold into Egypt. And now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve the life. For famine has been in the land for these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Do you see this perspective that Joseph has? He's not angry with them. I'm sure there was so much time in the middle that he was angry with them, where he didn't see what was going on. But now that he's at the end, he says, no, you're not the ones who recalculated my life. You're not the ones who sent me here, but that it was God who sent me here. It was all this terrible journey I went through so that I could be here to save our family's life, so that I could be here to keep the people of God alive and together, that the remnant would be saved, that no matter what my circumstances were, he remained faithful to God. And now here at the end, he sees, this is why, God, you brought me through this path, this journey. But there's no way Joseph knew all that, saw all that when he was in the midst of it. Like right now, a lot of you are in the midst of some pretty drastic recalculations. Everything in your life is changing or has changed, and you're really not sure what it's going to look like when we get through this. Like things will be changed and will probably be changed forever, where there's probably not going to be back to the original normal. Some of you have had so many things canceled. You've had so many big life events that should have been celebrated that haven't been able to be celebrated. And you're in the midst of it all. And you're like, why is God changing my life this way? This wasn't the plan that I had. And I can probably guarantee you that wasn't the plan Joseph had either. He did not start his life being the favorite son, thinking I'm going to end up being a slave and a prisoner and then second in charge of Egypt. But no matter what his circumstances were along the way, he trusted in God. No matter where he was in the journey, he remained faithful to God, believing that God would control the outcome. You're not in charge of the outcome. You're not in charge of where God's destination is for you. But what you are responsible for is being faithful to God, following Jesus no matter what circumstances he has placed you in. And as you are faithful to Jesus, as you are following him, he will get you where he needs you to go.
Thanks for being here for another session of the Quarantine Youth Group. Remember, no matter where God has you, no matter how he has recalculated your life, be faithful to him in all circumstances, and he will get you where he needs you to be. Being a believer, following God, doesn't mean their life is going to be easy. Doesn't mean that everywhere we go, it's going to be simple. It doesn't mean life's going to be all roses. There's some recalculations that happens that puts us in some tough situations. But if we are faithful to God, he will get us where he needs us to be. I pray that you guys are using this time to get into the Word, to pray for each other, that you are using this social distancing as a time for spiritual deepening. But for now, stay safe, wash your hands, and I'll see you next week. Bye.